The Ligrimon, A Christmas Ghost Story by Jack Graham. Read by Elliot Chapman. Shona took her chance. Work called him in. He had to leave her alone. Once she saw his car turn the corner at the end of the lane, she grabbed the bag she'd pre-packed and hidden, grabbed the money she'd slowly salted away and hidden, bluffed her mother-in-law, collected Maisie, and ran. On the train, her heart racing, Maisie sitting next to her, calm, watching the world race by outside. She texted her Uncle Angus. He wasn't really an uncle. He was a second cousin or something. She always called him uncle. He was so much older, and it was how he behaved. "Is it still okay? Are you sure?" she texted him, panicking. "Yes," he texted back immediately. "Thank you," she texted. She sent him a heart. "Thank God you're finally doing this," he sent. "When you get there, Mrs. McKinty at the cottage will let you in. I'll send you some money as soon as I can." He was from the rich side of the family, but one of the good ones. She laughed at the perfect spelling, grammar and punctuation of his texts. "I'm okay," she texted. "I'll be back in the country after Christmas," he texted. "I'll come up. You can stay as long as you need. I never used the place. Thank God I never sold it." "Why don't you live there?" she asked. He ignored the question, not like him. "How's little Maisie?" he asked instead. "Good as gold," she said, like always. Maisie sat still, silent, solemn. But was it goodness or emptiness, trust or resigned submission? Shona wondered if she had allowed her daughter to be harmed beyond repair, but she couldn't change things already done. All she could control was the future. "I don't like it there," he suddenly sent. Never did. But in an emergency. She sent him another heart. Travelling all day, through the night, that strange feeling as you went north, the feeling of going upward or climbing up the face of the world. For her also, the feeling of going home. One train after another, crossing the border, then a bus, then a cab, money almost gone, then finally they were there. So tired, so cold. A proper old-fashioned December. Maisie was asleep in her arms. She had not uttered one word of complaint or query. Mrs. McKinty threw open the door of the cottage the moment Shona rang the doorbell. Mrs. McKinty almost hugged Shona. Mrs. McKinty dragged them both inside. Mrs. McKinty made tea. Mrs. McKinty was so much older than the last time Shona had seen her. Kind, solicitous, curious but unquestioning. A widow now, jealously guarded by an orange cat. Maisie sat and looked at Mrs. McKinty's plastic Christmas tree. The cat came and sat in the gap made by her crossed legs. "I like your cat," said Maisie in her characteristic gabble. "He likes you," said Mrs. McKinty. Mrs. McKinty wrapped them up in coats and hats from the cupboard under a little staircase. Maisie was clearly a little sad to be leaving Mrs. McKinty's cottage, especially the cat and the tree. He had never let them have either, but she made no complaint. Mrs. McKinty took them up the short drive to the house, waving the beam of her old battery torch ahead of them. She let them in and handed over the key. The house was bright and warm. Mrs. McKinty had put the heating and lights on ready for them. Mrs. McKinty had made beds for them too. "Thank you, Mrs. McKinty," said Shona, trying not to break. Maisie said, "Thank you, Mrs. McKinty." Serious, like a grown-up. "Aren't you a dear wee thing?" said Mrs. McKinty, bending down to stroke the child's hair. "You sound like a proper lassie." It was true. Despite growing up in London, Maisie had her mother's accent. That was a good sign, surely. Mrs. McKinty left them. Maisie fell asleep on the sofa in the living room in front of the fire and the Christmas cartoon on the television. He didn't like the television either. "You watch all the bloody telly you like," she thought at Maisie. Shona found a blanket and draped it over the sleeping girl. She walked around the old place. She walked outside, heath and moor, stunted hedgerows and twisted little trees, low stone walls crumbling but steadfast, a blasted and buffeted landscape. No sheep, not any more, no other dwellings for miles around except Mrs. McKinty's cottage. She looked up at the frightening sky. She watched her breath escaping as steam. She looked up the hill to the forest, its edge like a wall dividing worlds. In the distance she could hear the ocean. The Atlantic? The North Sea? She'd never been sure which. Safe. Except she didn't feel safe. She felt watched. She felt hostile, suspicious eyes on her. Strangely, the unfriendly gaze seemed to be coming from a specific place. From up the hill. From the forest. Days passed. The two of them soon settled into quiet routines. The cat came to see them. Shona found tins of tuna in the kitchen. They were past their date, but the meat inside smelled fine, and the cat certainly didn't care. Maisie was entranced by feeding the animal, by the act of giving it food, by its gratitude. Shona allowed the house to get messy. He never allowed mess. Maisie said nothing about Christmas, but Shona would be damned if this would be another year without anything. She searched the house for decorations. She found some in a dusty old box at the back of a cupboard. Old baubles, proper glass ones, and a string of lights, not LEDs, little glass light bulbs tinted various colours with filaments inside, ancient and fragile. She plugged them in, not expecting them to work. They worked. They spilled little pools of blue and pink and red and green onto the carpet where they lay. A miracle. No artificial tree there. Not much money left. She checked on Maisie. The girl was asleep. The cat was curled up next to Maisie now, asleep in the nook made by her body. Shona went to the old shed. No tree there either. But she did find a large saw, so went to the foot of the hill and looked up at the forest. Again, that feeling of being watched by something in the trees, in the darkness. Maybe that was why Uncle Angus didn't like this place. She walked up the hill. She walked into the forest, ignoring the nagging sense she had of intruding, of trespassing, of being unwanted. She found a pine tree. It was small, a baby, and it was the right shape. She sawed it off at the base of its trunk. She didn't like doing it. It felt wrong, but she did it. Shona dragged the tree back down the hill, feeling like a murderer. The tree was healthy, strong. It barely shed any needles on the rough ground. Maisie awoke to see the tree propped up in the corner of the room, the box of old decorations and lights on the floor next to it. "We can decorate it together tomorrow," said Shona. Maisie broke her usual impassive reserve and beamed a huge smile. "We're going to be all right," thought Shona. But that night, as she and Maisie sat on the sofa together watching television, Shona had that same feeling of being watched. Only now it was inside the house with her. Without knowing why, she kept looking over at the tree. She fell asleep. She awoke around 3 a.m. Maisie was stood in the corner, staring at the tree. Shona hadn't heard anything, but she felt the curious certainty that Maisie had just been talking. The next morning they went over to see Mrs. McKinty. The orange cat trotted behind them. "Traitor," said Mrs. McKinty to the animal as it sauntered in through her feet, but she was smiling as she said it. They chatted. Shona and Mrs. McKinty argued amiably about who was going to have who over for Christmas dinner, who would cook for whom. "You must spend Christmas here," said Mrs. McKinty. "You haven't even got a tree over there." "Yes, we have," gabbled Maisie proudly. Shona explained. Mrs. McKinty's face fell. She started fussing around in the kitchen. She was still trying to be nice, but something was wrong. "I know I shouldn't have," said Shona, afraid she had offended the old woman who had been so kind to them, but Mrs. McKinty wouldn't meet her eye. When Shona and Maisie got back to the house, it was tidy. Someone had cleaned up, the lounge was in order, Maisie's toys and books were neatly stacked on one of the bookshelves, the fireplace had been brushed, the kitchen was spotless. The dirty dishes had been washed, dried and put away. The rubbish had been put in the bins and the bins had been emptied. There was black bags outside the back door by the coal hole. Upstairs the bathroom had been cleaned. Their beds had been made. He would have approved. Shona called Mrs. McKinty. "Did you get someone in?" she asked. "I don't know what you mean, dear," said Mrs. McKinty, but she sounded afraid. "I think it was the Ligrimon, Mummy," said Maisie. Shona asked her to repeat herself and to speak slowly. "I think it was the Ligrimon," said Maisie. "What's the Ligrimon, sweetie?" Maisie seemed to think better of having spoken. She looked up at Shona with a kind of glum reluctance, as if she was about to say something that would not be well received. "But the little man that lives in the Christmas tree," said Maisie. "He's green." Ligrimon, thought Shona. Little green man. Shona regarded her daughter. She had never known Maisie to tell a lie. It was strange, but it was true. Nor was Maisie the kind of child who imagined things. Shona remembered that feeling of being watched in the lounge the night she had brought the tree inside. She laughed at herself, but she walked to the tree as she did it. She crouched down to examine the tree. Maybe there was a knot in the trunk that looked like a face, something like that. She reached in through the tree's needle-laden branches, took hold of its thin and scaly core, and pulled it towards her. She turned it around. She peered in at every part of it. Nothing. But the sensation of being stared back at was unmistakable. She set the tree back against the wall and stood up. She turned to Maisie, who was studying her, waiting, impassive but tense. "Well," said Shona brightly, "if you see him again, tell him thanks for me for all the housework." They decorated the tree together. Maisie took the job very seriously. She stared at the finished product for a long time. She seemed to be studying the reflections of the little lights and the little glass baubles, the multicoloured shadows of branches cast on the walls, the spreading needles like little opening hands. That night, sitting in the lounge in front of the television after Maisie had finally been persuaded to go to bed, Shona stared at the tree herself. She experienced a shift in her perception, not unlike suddenly seeing the effect of an optical illusion. She saw past the branches, the baubles, the lights, through into the dark interior of the tree. And she saw two little bright black eyes watching her. No, they weren't eyes. They were chinks of light in patches of shadow. They were buds on the trunk. They were baubles seen from behind. Then they blinked at her. She jumped. Her body could not decide if it wanted to rush away from the tree or towards it, so she remained standing, paralysed, staring. The act of moving had dislodged her point of focus. She searched the tree again for the eyes, but couldn't find them. Her imagination. Or... She darted upstairs and looked in on Maisie. The cat was curled up beside her, as was now usual. They hadn't been the eyes of a cat, anyway. She knew that, if she were honest with herself. They had been too human. No, not human, but more human than a cat. She forced herself to go back downstairs, back into the lounge. Everything was normal and still. She looked at the tree. It just stood there, being a Christmas tree. Then she realised there was silence in the room. The television had been turned off. She stared at it. She saw the lights of the tree reflected in its dead grey screen. That was when the phone rang. It was Uncle Angus. "Shona, he knows where you are. He called me. He pretended to be asking if I knew, but he knew, I could tell." "When was this?" she asked. "Just now," he replied, panicked. So she had time. If he was still in London, but maybe he wasn't. It would be just like him to... She ran upstairs. "Maisie, darling, we have to go. Get your stuff." Maisie, rubbing her eyes. "I don't want to, Mummy. I like it here." "We have to, sweetie." 20 minutes later, they were in Mrs. McKinty's cottage, waiting for a taxi. They would go to the nearest town and get a hotel room. Angus had sent some money. "Take care," said Mrs. McKinty. "Stay in touch. Let me know." Shona looked around, suddenly conscious of an absence. "Where's Maisie?" Running down the path back to the house, bursting through the door. Maisie in the lounge, standing in front of the Christmas tree. "Ligrimon says I don't have to go," said Maisie. "He doesn't want me to go either." "We have to, Maisie," she snapped. That was when the tree started trembling, shaking, rocking. The decorations jostled and jangled. Baubles fell from their hooks and smashed on the floor as something parted the branches and slowly crawled out. The tree toppled backwards as the thing ejected itself. It hit the floor on all fours. For a moment it crouched, unmoving. With the suddenness and speed of a mouse, it scampered away a few feet and then stopped again. It slowly stood up and turned. It was manlike in shape and proportion, but impossibly small. It was naked. Its skin was blackish-green, wrinkled and leathered, like the skin of an old man. But there was an awful strength in the tiny but obscenely lithe and muscular little body. Its minuscule hands and feet, fingers and toes were long and thin, and all ended in thick, curving claws. It looked up at Shona with glittering black little eyes and smiled. Mrs. McKinty called the house when the taxi arrived. No answer. She asked the driver to wait and ran to the house. She found Shona in a pool of reeking, steaming blood in the lounge, her throat raggedly torn open, 2 holes welling with red where her eyes had been. Maisie was stood over her dead mother, staring down at her. With an agility she hadn't known she could still summon up, Mrs. McKinty lunged for the child, grabbed her, hoisted her up onto her hip, and raced from the room. Back at the cottage, Mrs. McKinty's sobbing called the police and an ambulance. Much as Shona had earlier, Mrs. McKinty suddenly became aware of the absence of Maisie. In a frenzy, she raced around the cottage, calling, crying. The taxi driver had heard something and was banging on the door. "Is everything all right in there?" Mrs. McKinty found Maisie in the kitchen, kneeling on the linoleum in front of the back door, munching on the entrails of the cat. Mrs. McKinty screamed. Maisie looked up at her. "I like your cat," she said, enunciating each syllable with great care. She smiled widely, revealing blood-caked teeth, and her little black eyes glittered.